ritual up here in my attic, but I thought that that would just play into my the stereotype that I am a tree hugging hippie from Austin up in the Texas Senate. All of that is true. It's great to have you all here. Happy to have everybody who's joining the Policy Pint today. And this will be our last Policy Pint before the end of the legislative session. The only reason for that, I love these Policy Pints. The only reason for that is that the final weeks of the legislative session are too difficult to predict for scheduling purposes. So we will be back with Policy Pints in the summer. So stick with us. I'm really, really happy to have you all here. For those of you who are newcomers to the Policy Pints, the way this works is I have a dynamite all-star panel of people who are super smart on the issue who will give us a crash course in the challenges and the solutions on big topics facing Texas today. And those of you who have joined us by Zoom, you can participate in the sidebar chat, and that is a very important conversation. We often amplify stuff off the chat into the panel discussion. And for those of you who are watching on Facebook, sit back and enjoy it, and feel free to send us a Facebook message later and we'll get back with you. So today we're going to be exploring climate change because it's Earth Day, and what are our challenges and our opportunities in Texas. We have an all-star panel that I'm super excited about to walk us through the facts and what each of us can do to make a difference. We've got Dr. Michael Weber, who is a professor at the University of Texas in energy resource and mechanical engineering. Dr. Weber's research focuses on the convergence of policy, technology, and resource management related to energy and the environment. Dr. Weber is a former commissioner for Austin Energy, former deputy director of the Energy Institute at UT, and has published multiple books on the modern understanding of energy and sustainability. Michael, thank you so much for being here. We also have Dana Harmon. She serves as the executive director of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, where she leads research on data to be used to mitigate energy costs for low-income consumers. With a background in oil and gas and engineering, Ms. Harmon has been responsible for the successful launch of technologies and research within her field. And thank you so much, Dana, for being here. It's great to see you. We have John Hall, who leads the Environmental Defense Fund's clean energy efforts in Texas. Mr. Hall has previously chaired the Texas Water Commission and the Texas Natural Resources Conservation Commission. Some of us who are old enough to remember Trainwreck was the predecessor to TCEQ. John also served as the executive director of the Texas Environmental Research Consortium in Houston. Mr. Hall has spent his career in environmental advocacy with the aim of curbing Texas's carbon emissions and to aid the state in gaining a position in the global energy market. Thanks so much for being here, John. We also have Suzanne Russo, who serves as the CEO for the Pecan Street Project. She has previously served as the Director of Sustainability Initiatives for the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, where she led green building and sustainability for affordable housing projects. With her background in community and regional planning, Ms. Russo has worked all over the world, focusing on community-based sustainable development. Suzanne, it's great to have you here. And we also expect, although we will be understanding if she can't make it, Representative Erin Zwiener, who serves as the chair of the House Climate Caucus. She's the only House member with a professional background in conservation, and Representative Zwiener is passionate about promoting clean energy, clean water, and the fight against climate change. Representative Zwiener also serves as a founding member of the LGBTQ caucus and is a 3-time Jeopardy winner. There's a little piece of trivia for you. We'll see if Representative Zwiener can make it. She is currently engaged in the debate around the budget on the House floor, but she's going to try and drop in. So let's just jump right in. I will tee this off by saying just yesterday, I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues about the fact that the state of Texas is the largest generator of CO2 in the nation. And we had a spirited conversation around that. And I asked him whether he favored incentivizing a reduction in CO2. And his response was no. The market should handle it. The market's going to handle it. That is the prevailing response I get from many of my colleagues in the Texas Senate and the Texas legislature overall, that somehow the market is going to pivot from fossil fuels, in which we are deeply entrenched, and magically adopt renewables and alternative energy technologies without governmental intervention. So I'm going to start out with Dr. Weber. This week, the Biden administration announced that it would like to cut greenhouse emissions by half by 2030. And since Texas is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases and also one of the largest generators of energy, how are we going to do that? How do you see this playing out in Texas? How are the feds going to get Texas to do this? And what would you recommend we do to help out?
Great question and great comments. Let me add a few more data points on top of what you said. So Texas is the #1 emitter of CO2 in the nation. We're number 6 or 7 in the world, just to get some global relevance in there. We're also the #1 sequesterer of CO2. We put more CO2 in the ground than anyone else, mostly for enhanced oil recovery. But it turns out we know a lot about carbon, whether it's dumping it in the atmosphere or putting it in the ground. And that's an interesting opportunity for us. So if we look at our CO2 emissions, we're up there with like Canada and Australia and Germany, this kind of thing. So we're a global scale emitter. We're also number 6 or 7 in the world on wind production, number 4 on oil and refining, and number 3 on gas. So we're a big energy producer. And because we've emitted so much CO2 for so long, people are nervous that we got rich emitting CO2. Therefore, if we don't emit CO2, we'll no longer be rich. And I think that's not quite right, because we also have a lot of the low carbon solutions. So with the Biden administration saying we need to cut our carbon emissions dramatically by 2030 and certainly by 2050, this inspires fear for Texas, like, well, we got rich and we didn't care about carbon. We don't want to be poor. But I would suggest actually we can get even richer when we do care about carbon, because the low carbon solutions tend to be things like wind and solar, of which we have abundance. It also includes things like energy storage, which we are now manufacturing in Texas and can install a large scale. It includes things like offshore wind and solar, and we have the biggest offshore industry around. It also includes geothermal, which we know a lot about when it comes to drilling. So a lot of the low carbon solutions are things Texas can lead in as well. So there's a real opportunity for us. And the question is, will we get on board or not? You raise this point, does a market get us there or not? The market actually gets us started, I would say, because the clean solutions are the cheaper solutions now. Consumers now prefer the cleaner options. And the ESG money, this environmental sustainable governance money, which is a third of the private capital out there, is requiring it. So the markets have sent some pretty strong signals. We need to decarbonize, but there's still a role for policy for 2 reasons. One is the markets aren't going to get us there quite fast enough. And so there's value in a nudge from policy, but also the markets can be messy. And when the markets have disruption, that means displacement of people. Usually that is inequitable. And so there's a role for policy to make the transition smoother, to anticipate the transition, to prepare for it, because there are real humans involved when jobs shift either location or type. And so we need to think about that. So there's a role for policy, but the markets are playing a role to get us started. In Texas, we're already decarbonizing, whether we care about it or not, and that's mostly by market forces. But I would say policies to accelerate and smooth what we're doing would be better for us. The way the Biden administration will get us on board is through money, frankly. So there's a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. $100 billion of that is just for the grid. Texas is about 9% of the national population and 12% of the GDP in CO2. So maybe we'll get like 10% of that money just for the grid. Well, that's $10 billion. And we're talking about how we need to winterize the grid, and that will cost like $10 billion. Well, the Biden administration is telling us they're going to give us $10 billion. So I think using money to sort of buy our goodwill is one way to go about it. And that's probably one of the things that will happen. We have an ethos of making money in Texas, so I think money will talk. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that we can lead and should lead, and we can choose not to lead. And some of the choices not to lead are presented before us at the legislative level and elsewhere. And I hope we'll follow the market signals and use policy to accelerate it, and then we'll be in great position for the next few decades to really profit off the world's transition.
Well, you raise an interesting point that I have been learning since I've been in the Senate, that the state of Texas is, I mean, I suppose I should have known this, that the state of Texas is highly dependent on infusions of federal cash. And it enables the state of Texas not to develop sustainable funding resources at the state level. And this is intriguing to me as we're arguing over the budget, but that is a policy point for another day.
A lot of federal money for NASA, agriculture, roads, military, right? Texas is a big recipient of federal money. That's right.
Very big recipient. And so we're seeing that truly has enabled the state to basically live off of federal and local revenue generation and do very little of its own. But again, that's a policy point for another day. Ms. Harmon, I wanted to ask you, actually, Dr. Weber teed it up. Dr. Weber, you spoke of displacement. That I'm presuming you're speaking of displacement in the labor force that is in the energy sector. But I wanted to speak for a moment about equity with regard to the cost of retooling. Achieving these goals through investment in infrastructure and energy efficiency will certainly cost us some money. As Dr. Weber mentioned, the market is already going there. And so in some regard, I'm guessing, but this is really a question to the two of y'all. I'm guessing that since the market's already going there, some of this maintenance and operation is moving off of old technologies and going into investment in newer technologies. And so in some regard, it'll be a wash, but in some other ways, there's going to be a cost to this retooling that will be borne by the end user. And I have been reading up some. One study shows that approximately 4.8 million households were unable to pay at least one energy bill during the past year. We saw in snowvid, after snowvid, or Winter Storm Uri, more accurately termed, that individuals were hit with some pretty significant bills. What is the state of energy insecurity in Texas, and what can we do about that as we retool?
Thank you. It's an incredibly interesting and in some ways complicated question, and especially relevant when we think about how might we, achieve our emissions reductions goals while being mindful of energy equity and addressing energy insecurity. And what does an equitable energy transition look like? I'd like to just start by what we mean when we say energy insecurity, which is basically an inability to adequately meet basic household energy needs. And since 2016, our institute has been studying energy insecurity in Texas, and we know from our work that people struggling with energy insecurity are often forced to make trade-offs with limited resources that they have. And really the COVID-19 pandemic has just compounded that struggle. Our research here at the Institute and of other scholars is showing that households, facing energy insecurity may delay or skip necessary spending on other expenses, such as food or clothing, in order to pay utility bills, and are more likely to engage in risky behaviors related to energy deprivation. For example, keeping homes at temperatures that may exacerbate certain health conditions, or resorting to high-cost methods to pay energy bills, such as payday loans. So we want to avoid as much as possible exacerbating that condition. And the socio-demographic context is really important when we think about the disparities in our energy system. And we see significant disparities along the lines of income, of course, but also by race, noting that Black and Hispanic households experience greater energy insecurity, even when income is accounted for. We're also seeing greater prevalence in families with young children, in households with individuals who rely on electronic medical devices, and also people who live in residences in poor condition. Since the onset of the pandemic, we've really been tracking how the crisis is deepening that energy insecurity. In a survey that we conducted in mid-October of 2020, showed that people who are self-identifying as financially strained have been affected by the pandemic from an energy perspective. And we see a definite trend in unaffordable electric bills among low-income households and communities of color. And so to your question with regard to investments in infrastructure and how are these costs going to flow, we really have to be mindful of kind of these dual objectives of an equitable transition, and making sure that both the costs and the benefits of the transition are equitably distributed. And we know with regard to climate change that people that are already facing energy insecurity are often unable to withstand sudden shocks like those caused by extreme weather. We certainly saw this with Hurricane Harvey, and then most recently with the winter storm, which frankly, exposed vulnerabilities in our energy system that most of us would have considered unimaginable. When many of us and our loved ones experience firsthand what energy insecurity feels like. And the effects aren't just lost power and damage from burst pipes and those sorts of things, but also lost wages and lost food, groceries full of food, which can have cascading effects on households. But really, we see the opportunity here to kind of address both challenges at once, and the opportunity to address energy insecurity through thoughtful applications of energy efficiency and infrastructure investments. And of course, there's a lot of discussion again about how we define infrastructure. But really, many studies are showing that the quality of housing stock has a lot to do with energy insecurity. And many people are living in homes that aren't properly weatherized or energy insufficient, which is increasing those costs and exacerbating the problem. A recent study conducted by our organization in Harris County, Texas, or the Houston area, showed that basically we could economically address the energy affordability gap through residential energy efficiency investments in low-income housing. So we think there's a lot of opportunity there to holistically address the problem of energy insecurity, while simultaneously meeting some of our goals related to emissions reductions.
Well, you're totally preaching to the choir over here, because we actually presented a bill this week about energy efficiency to help folks out. So, Mr. Hall, as we're looking at this, and that's so interesting, Ms. Harmon, when you say that it's hitting folks who are low income, but also hitting folks in racial demographics, even after controlling for income, leading one to believe, and I'm imagining that this is the speculation, that infrastructure investments are not equitably distributed irrespective of income. Is that the explanation for that?
Well, income is definitely a key variable, but so is race. I share two developments that occurred in 1901. In 1901, Spindletop was found near Beaumont, and that created the massive growth in the energy sector in Texas, particularly fossil fuel. That same year, the Texas legislature put in place the poll tax to limit the voting rights of Latino African Americans. And when that didn't stamp out voting completely by those two constituencies, they passed legislation creating the white primary, saying that only white voters could vote in that primary, which was tantamount to the election of who occupied our state offices. Fast forward 120 years later, our legislature seeking to cut back on voting rights, and engaged in an effort to stop the incredible progress we've been making toward the clean energy economy. The good news is this: if we have the foresight to take advantage of unique resources in terms of growing our clean energy resources, which are the most economical today, which happen to be emission-free, and if we also take advantage of our position to lead the country, if not the world, with regard to clean transportation, the growth of utilization of those resources begin to solve lots of our climate pollution, air pollution challenges, public health issues associated with that. And so these technologies offer us great opportunity in solving some of our biggest challenges. But I would suggest also, in addition to creating a climate so that these resources can take off and really help grow the state's economy and enable Texas to potentially maintain its industrial base. We've got to make sure we are deliberate and thoughtful about addressing the issues of energy equity plus environmental justice and environmental racism, particularly in the energy sector. The current, oil and gas has dominated our state's economy for years, and there are massive casualties in terms of public health challenges, economic poverty, real issues confronting communities of color driven by our energy sector. And while I'm a big fan of our clean energy sector that's emerging, unless deliberate and thoughtful actions are taken to make sure that policies and market strategies are put in place to make sure that the benefits of these emerging effective technologies are provided to communities of color as well as low income, we will see the serious equity and EJ challenges that we have continue. So hopefully we will have the courage and the vision to recognize we've got this tremendous opportunity, if we choose, to grow our state's economy by deploying these resources and simultaneously make sure we're expanding the opportunities they provide to all segments of our population.
And I see most of that occurring at the municipal level and not so much at the state level, at least in Texas. I'm seeing municipalities, major urbanized areas, putting together programs, particularly through their municipally owned power companies, but also through their health and human services departments to do weatherization, to provide incentives for electric water heaters over gas heaters when it's time to replace those, to do long-term loans for solar paneling, residential solar panels, as well as the PACE program for commercial properties. But I'm not seeing a whole lot of that kind of incentive at the consumer level coming down out of the state. Am I just missing something?
Well, I think you're right. I think politics matter. And at the local levels, particularly our major cities, we've got progressive politics because of the voting constituencies there. We have it now occurring at the federal level in the Biden administration. It's amazing what the president has put forth in terms of executive orders and what he's trying to do through statute. But then at the state level, politics is very different. Mm-hmm. And perhaps we won't see the progress at the state level that we would like until politics change. So our Republican friends move to the center and focus on solutions, or we have a change altogether. But we have tremendous opportunities in this state on things that Republicans traditionally have said are very important to them: growing the economy and utilizing market forces to get there. And we've got the best opportunity in the country, if not the world, to do that. The question is, can we? Will we?
So, Ms. Russo, I know the Pecan Street Project is doing a lot of research and ways to potentially address climate change, ranging from energy to water to soil research. Can you highlight some of the findings that your research has been elevating?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the findings is that policy matters when you're talking about market development. I'm going to disagree a little bit with Dr. Weber, so maybe the conversation will get a little spicy. But, I don't think that markets are going to kickstart the clean energy transformation. And that was kickstarted by policy, particularly here in Texas, our wind energy economy, which is booming and provides a lot of us with really affordable power while also creating a lot of really great jobs in the state. That's the direct result of the renewable portfolio standard that the state passed as part of deregulation. So I think markets really like policy, good policy, that serves as guardrails, but also signposts that lets companies know where to invest their resources in research and development and attracting new consumers and creating new services and products. And so the policies that the Texas legislature are developing right now, I think, are very hurtful to our markets. And quite frankly, I think it poses a real and present danger to Texas' ability to economically recover from COVID. Because the state, the rest of the country and the world, everybody understands that the clean energy transition is happening. Capital investments around the world have been declining steadily for the past few years in oil and gas, while rising quite rapidly in solar and wind. And as Mr. Hall pointed out, now renewable resources are the cheapest form of energy available to us if we don't disrupt that with policies that are punitive to solar and wind, as our legislature is currently heading towards. So that's a big part of what our research has shown, is that the markets are growing, that customers want solar and wind, and that clean energy technology is developing much faster from a data and an information technology perspective than oil and gas. And data is revolutionizing every sector of our economy, and energy is going to be no different. Clean energy technologies are much better positioned because they've co-evolved with information technology to get inserted into our grid and to help us solve a lot of the problems that we saw, like with Superstorm Uri, and with creating more equitable and affordable energy for all of Texans to enjoy, while having the benefits of cleaning up our air, creating new jobs, creating more wealth here in our state. So there are really simple solutions that we could be leveraging to help make the entire grid here in our state more resilient, if we were to rely more on clean energy and less on fossil fuels. Again, because of the information technology that exists within things like solar panels on rooftops and electric vehicles and in-home batteries. Those technologies are primed for smart management, which is what we need in the state as we have more and more unreliable weather patterns as a result of climate change.
So an odd thing that I was just overhearing in the Senate, because I'm not on this committee and I was waiting for something else. And I don't know all the facts, so I'm not even pretending to know all the facts. So I'll put it out basically as a hypothetical, is that there is apparently a wind farm out near the Devil's River, and it's owned by a Chinese businessman. And some people are super freaked out about this, feeling that the Chinese businessman is too close to the government of China. And therefore this wind farm is actually some sort of sleeper cell activity to, shut down the wind farm during a peaker moment and mess up the Texas grid. And I only raise this because as I hear these sorts of things, I realize that yes, clean energy, we're in the middle of a clean energy transformation, and it's threatening a lot of long-held beliefs about who we are and who's in charge here. So not to go too deep into world politics, but we are seeing after Superstorm Uri, sorry, I didn't turn off my phone the way I should have. After Superstorm Uri, there was a backlash against renewables, as if the renewables had something to do with our instability. And we're also seeing some of my labor friends pushing back on what we are trying to do in renewables out of fear that the 200,000 jobs in oil and gas may not be there in the future. And how do we retool for those 200,000 oil and chemical workers who have good union jobs? One of the only strong unions in the state of Texas, other than uniformed unions. And how are we, so I'm getting a lot of pushback from people who are concerned about the very heavy involvement of China and Asian countries in the component parts for renewables, and fear that our good jobs are going to go away. So y'all all jump in. I'm not going to throw this out to any specific person. Y'all jump in.
Let me play for you a parallel story in my head. You're worried about a Chinese wind farm owner who's too close to the Chinese government and might sort of meddle with the markets by creating scarcity that makes energy more expensive or less available. And that reminds me of gas companies who are very close to the Texas government who could create scarcity to get a high price and make energy less reliable, which is what we just went through 2 months ago. So that sounds like projection to me. So like, here's what I do in my industry. Perhaps this Chinese person is doing the same thing. And I think that's actually what happened at Winter Storm Uri, is that gas supplies failed. There were freeze-offs. The system in the gas system started to fail February 10th and 11th. They started to cut off firm customers, including power plants. The power outages happened February 15th. That started to make it worse because some of the gas system depends on power. There's a narrative right now, well, it happened February 15th, by the way, that wind was to blame. And at that point, gas was already down in its production substantially. I want to say like 20% or something like that. So gas failed starting the 10th or 11th, and then other systems started to fail. So the narrative was that wind failed and wind struggled and wind underperformed. There were certainly wind turbines coated with ice and solar panels that had turned away from the snow and that kind of thing. But now there's a new report that came out today. They say, if you talk to oil and gas, they say the reason they had freeze offs and problems with the gas system is because their power was cut off. But the power was actually cut off 4 or 5 days later. I can't make sense of the report that came out today. So this is a very important part of the narrative. We really need to understand. Unfortunately, there's plenty of blame to go around, that we can find failures with coal and nuclear and gas and wind and solar. But the gas system really failed. And I think what Suzanne said is that we need to consider diversifying our energy mix further. Right now, it's 50% gas and power, 20% coal, 10% nukes, and 20% wind and solar. So it's 80% thermal, 70% fossil fuel. Maybe we need to diversify further so that we don't have all our eggs in one basket. I think that's one of the solutions. But there are so many things in what you said around sort of, I think, projection about what a market manipulator might do and flimsiness. But if we flimsiness of the energy system, but if we look at union jobs, which I don't know a whole lot about, but I'll tell you that the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW, is very excited about wind and solar build out and grid modernization. Like, there are a lot of union jobs. They might be different union jobs. It might not be oil and gas union jobs. It might be electrical jobs, and the jobs pay differently in their different locations. The electrical jobs tend to be much more stable. Oil and gas layoffs can be something like 150,000 people in 1 month in Houston in 2016, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. You don't get those kind of layoffs in the renewables industry because it's a growing industry. And you don't get it in electricity anyway because it's not a commoditized thing that's sold the way it is in oil and gas. So you don't get the price swings, and therefore you don't get the boom bust cycles. So I think the job scenario will be different. I think mostly it'll be growing and stable rather than sort of volatile, including a lot of layoffs as we have today with fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in on that? The two stories that you told are interesting because they contradict each other. What the state of Texas should be doing is investing in research and development around renewables because it's a growing market everywhere in the world. And working really hard to leverage the great engineering talent we have coming out of the University of Texas system in our tech sector and the wealth of knowledge that we have in the state around energy to grow out the clean energy economy in the state and to position Texas as the global leader. There will be massive job growth and, again, massive wealth opportunities here in the state if we do that. And a Chinese business owner coming into the state of Texas and owning a power generation resource is a direct result of the state of Texas not investing enough money in home growing those businesses. And we absolutely should. There's no reason that it's more economically feasible for a Chinese business to come and produce energy in our state than for a Texas business to do that. It's simply a lack of investment in growing those businesses at the state level. And that is something that China and other states in our country, like California and New York, are doing. And they are the ones that are going to see that big growth in those jobs. And in those companies that are going to go locate there. And clean energy is a lot of really great manufacturing jobs associated with it. I just want to put that plug out. Those are great manufacturing jobs, which are sorely needed in our state and in our country.
They really are. John, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that I agree with everything that Dr. Weber and Ms. Russo has said. I would also add this. I mean, there's going to be some dislocations associated with the growth in our economy in the future, including as we transition to a clean energy economy. And yes, government ought to make sure that there are policies in place to help transition various workers to growing sectors. That just makes sense for us to do. And that way we can minimize the impact of the dislocations that may occur.
So let's talk about that for a moment, because that's another area where I see really looking to the federal government and the local government to figure that piece out. The Texas Workforce Commission actually has some really good folks in it, and they're working super hard, mostly with federal dollars, and then reaching down into our local workforce commissions for retooling and providing that kind of adult education for people to transition to different jobs. I'm not seeing a whole lot of that happening at the state level, but I am seeing federal infusion and going straight down into local workforce commissions to do that kind of retool. And I'm super excited about that. Also through our community college system. That's really exciting to me. And I think that it may be an opportunity for us to reinvent ourselves as the new energy capital of the United States. With a whole new generation of individuals working in the energy sector in ways that they feel really, really great about. I am a little concerned that, we did a solar farm back when I was a county judge. We did a tax rebate for a solar farm and said, you get the tax rebate if you go on to ERCOT. If you're actually putting X number of megawatts onto ERCOT by such and such date, then we'll give you a rebate. The construction of the solar farm had jobs, but the actual operation of the solar farm only took 6 people. So it's a different workforce that we will be growing. It will be mostly in maintenance and operation, construction, maintenance and operation, with very, it's just not as labor intensive. And I do worry about that from a labor sector standpoint. I don't know if any of y'all have any input on that. There's nothing to do about it. We're transitioning anyway. So we're going to have to be thinking of where these folks go. It may be through attrition that we change up our labor force here.
I think so there'll be a lot of growth in renewables for decades is what we anticipate with our own modeling of Texas. So there'll be a lot of new jobs created. There will also be some jobs that won't grow. And I think we haven't seen job growth in oil and gas. A lot of that is from automation, but also there've been so many waves of layoffs over the last few decades that sometimes oil and gas has trouble recruiting people back into the industry. So it's easier just to use automation and mechanization. That's also an efficiency play for oil and gas and a way to clean things up and improve the safety. So we'll see some attrition in oil and gas because of automation, and we'll see growth in renewables. The renewables jobs are primarily in construction, as you noted. There aren't as many needed for operations and maintenance, which is both a good news story. It's an efficiency story. You need fewer people to maintain the wind farm, but it's also tough on jobs. That means it employs fewer people as well. So something we need to prepare for. And the question is, when we're done with the build out will take decades, just like it did before. We did a massive build out United States from the 1930s to 1970s and kind of put it on hold for a few decades. That's why we're due for another build out. Maybe this build out lasts 3 or 4 decades. Then what? Do we just go into coasting maintenance mode or what? So I think the next few decades will be easier because there'll be job growth, but the geography will matter. It won't be in the same location. I think engineering skills can translate from one sector to another, but people don't necessarily want to live in those other places. This is more of a sticking point in Appalachia than in Texas, which is coal mining as a local job, and they don't necessarily have solar as an option. And the people in Appalachia don't necessarily want to move. In Texas, we have a little more labor fluidity. It seems like that's anecdotal. I don't know that to be true, but it seems to be true, which is people can move around more readily in Texas. They're less tied to their hometown. But also we have this co-location of Midland for oil and gas and wind and solar. So you can meet people geographically with this transition in a way that might be harder in other parts of the nation. This is fortunate for Texas. But the coal plants are on the eastern part of the state. As we shut those down and build wind farms, those will be in the western part of the state. So there'll be some geographic shifts that might be tough.
So we talked mostly about energy generation so far. I'm going to switch the conversation up and talk for a moment about transportation, which accounts for about 35% of our CO2 emissions nationally. It's probably a little less in Texas because we have so much industrial output. But we do have significant tailpipe emissions, and we're starting to see a burgeoning market in electric vehicles. But they are at a price point that are beyond most people. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the social equity around that. I do have an electric vehicle that I bought used. It's a Fiat 500e that I got used for 10,000 bucks. Way cheaper than a Tesla or some of those Ford electric sport utility vehicles that I think are selling for $70,000 or something like that. So, I mean, Dana, do you have any input on that in terms of, you know, the regular guy and gal being able to access the benefits of these new technologies as they're becoming available?
Absolutely, and it's a very good question, and we certainly see this wave of electric vehicles coming down the pipe, and have lots of questions about how do we make sure that we ensure equitable access, how do we provide access to financing, and there are studies coming out showing that the overall transportation burden associated with the electric vehicles over the life of those vehicles, including operations and maintenance, is reduced compared to internal combustion engines. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there if we're able to develop pathways and pipelines for access for people, for low to moderate income folks across our state, so that it's not just accessible for folks in the market for Teslas. I think as we're talking about electric mobility, it's also really important to consider other forms of transportation, including electrification of public transit, and looking at, you know, micro mobility, electric scooters, e-bikes, and how accessible are those technologies to people for getting around. So I think that we need to look more holistically. You know, I mentioned energy cost burden before, and our focus has largely been on residential energy cost burden, but increasingly, I think it's important to look holistically to include transportation cost burden as well, and look at how do we make sure that those technologies and the benefits of those technologies are accessible overall.
The transportation cost burden, I've heard it said that the thumbnail is that the average family spends about $10,000 a year on transportation costs when you figure in car payment and insurance and gasoline and toll taxes and whatnot. And that if you can give them an alternative to that, you give them a big fat raise, and a $10,000 raise would be super sweet. John, I wanted to ask you, there's you know, movement in the Texas legislature right now to create a fee on hybrids and EVs. Because currently they are not making an investment. They're not user feed to invest in our transportation network. What are your thoughts there? I mean, I too believe that these hybrids and EVs need to contribute, but how do we do that and keep incentivizing the switch to these electronic and hybrid vehicles so that we meet that Biden challenge of cutting our carbon emissions in half by 2030?
Well, I think the good news is that electric vehicles are just going to be cheaper to light duty, medium duty.
Mm-hmm.
And so consumers will experience savings on that end. I do think it's important for our growing clean energy economy and clean transportation to step up and pay their part. I think that's. I mean, I think we will lose if we try to exempt these technologies from paying their part, for example, for the maintenance of highways.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key is that these fees remain reasonable. And if we can set fees for a light duty vehicle around $100 per vehicle, I think that's reasonable. And I think the savings that consumers would realize would be much greater. So clean transportation and clean energy has got to step up and do their part in terms of maintaining our social construct in terms of government and paying for infrastructure, but we need to keep it reasonable and make sure it's not punitive. And I think even with that, we will see these technologies continue to grow and provide substantial additional savings to persons of our background. And I'm optimistic that even in low income and in communities of color, increased awareness in those communities about these technology benefits they can provide economically and socially, I think that will be a great deal of excitement. about these technologies, and because they simultaneously can reduce costs, but also substantially improve the environment in these communities. So, but the key is an awareness campaign on an ongoing basis to introduce these technologies and make sure that these constituencies become familiar with these technologies, embrace them, and take advantage of the opportunities that they provide, which is a role that government, that's the important role that government can play, is to level the playing field and to make sure policies are put in place to address various social and economic issues that sometimes get us off the path in terms of trying to achieve equity and justice.
Yeah, I think I got a tax break for buying a used EV. And I could not be happier with it. It's it was $10,000, y'all. And it's cute as a button. It only goes about 80 miles before you have to charge it again, but I don't go very far. So it works out for me. But to your point, Mr. Hall, we're talking about getting the word out to people and how we can incentivize, how we can educate people. You know, what are y'all's suggestions for how we can get people on board with weatherizing their homes, weatherizing their businesses, switching over to an electric car, that it doesn't have to be a Tesla at a price point beyond your reach, that you can get a used Fiat 500e. How do we change the hearts and minds of some of our rural leadership that really doesn't get this? It's a huge advantage to them too. I mean, Dr. Weber, you said right at the beginning of this that Texas also leads the nation in carbon sequestration. And the reason why we do is because we have so much unpopulated land. So how do we make this attractive to our more rural, more conservative neighbors who we are reliant upon winning their hearts and minds?
I feel like there's a lot of moral, ethical, and philosophical reasons why we need to decarbonize, but there are also some compelling economic reasons to decarbonize. And I feel like the economic justifications are often left out of the story or more difficult to explain, or they're murky. And there's a lot of cost of doing nothing that we forget about. We talk about the cost of doing something, but the cost of inaction is very expensive. The Winter Storm Uri itself was 100 to 200 billion, Hurricane Harvey, 132 billion. The drought and freeze of 2011 were tens to hundreds of billions. Like, these are expensive, and they're just going to become more frequent and more expensive. We might as well take action to save that money. So we talk about long-term financial planning, investing some money now to save some money or avoid some costs later makes sense. In most of the solutions we're talking about, better insulation for your home, triple pane windows, a better air conditioner, an EV, they cost more upfront, but then they cost less to operate and use. And so if you amortize over the proper horizon out 20 to 50 years, the environmental solution is the economic solution. They are the same. But at the short term, over the next few months when you're installing or building, there's a mismatch. The environmental solution feels more expensive because it's a more expensive capital expenditure, but the OpEx, the operational costs, are much lower. And so if we could get to longer term thinking with our financing, that'd be better. But it's hard for a lot of people to do that 30-year amortization by themselves. And so there's a financing problem. That's where there's an opportunity for policy to help bring down the upfront costs. That's why PACE was so important. You can put it into your tax bill over 20 years. Instead of paying $20,000 for your solar panels at once, you pay it over many years, and you use the savings on your electric bill to pay the cost of the panels. So we need more financing policy options to solve that trade-off for us, because not all of us can do it easily ourselves. And then the right answer emerges to the top of the pile, because the cheap solution is the clean solution.
So, you know, with PACE, really it was getting the bankers on board. PACE, government came in after the bankers came on board and said, hey, listen, this is a great opportunity to rent cash at secured by a rock solid security. I mean, what could be more secure than a debt that runs with the infrastructure that's been improved? The infrastructure that is now more valuable because of this improvement. So the bankers were all over it. They're like, hell yeah, I'll lend that money because I know I'm getting that money back. And then governments came on board just to create the PACE scaffolding necessary at the governmental level. So what other industries can we reach into to convince that it's to their advantage? And the agricultural community comes to mind.
I have a wonderful story.
Yes.
Wonderful story. I serve on the PACE board, and in Erath County is the dairy capital of the world. And there are situations where a dairy farmer will have hundreds of cattle on 25 to 30 acres of land. And so the cattle that we get our milk from are walking around in mud up to their thighs. Mm-hmm. And I was on a call with a board meeting with PACE last week, and one of the largest dairy farmers in the country, operating out of Erath County, Texas, is getting a PACE loan to basically completely revolutionize his operations, so that all of the waste that's generated by 500 cows on 20 acres of land, a system is being put in place to treat that waste, convert it to product, and make sure it's not released into the Brazos River system and contaminate the water supplies for Waco, Texas. And the owner said that the only way that he could move forward to install this new technology in operation is because of PACE. And just goes to what Dr. Weber was saying, that financing mechanisms to deal with that upfront cost is real important. And because of PACE is one of those financing mechanisms that's created and is cost effective, we may see a revolution in the dairy industry in this state, which would substantially reduce water pollution as well.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering, how do we need to create what kind of market do we need to create in order to get more sequestration, or do we? Is it just going to happen naturally?
I mean, I think
sequestration, you know, it kind of just happens. How do you credit?
We should have a marketplace, right? So we pay people to deal with our solid waste. We pay the trucks to take it away and landfill it or recycle it or incinerate it. We pay people to deal with our liquid waste. We should pay people to deal with our gaseous waste. Create a fee structure to pay for CO2 disposal and management. We all emit, so however many it is, 20 tons per person in Texas or something like that. And we should pay for that and pay for someone to take it away. And then once you create a payment scheme, there are many ways to deal with it. We might sequester it below ground, which is the way it's done today, but we could also embed it in products. We could have it in trees and crops. We could do soil carbon sequestration. It's something that I've been thinking about, and others on the call, like Suzanne and her team and others, and people at Rice think about this, is create an agricultural carbon market where there are people around the world who will happily pay for offsets, and we in Texas can take the CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it into trees, crops, or soil and collect a fee, creating another revenue stream for farmers. So if you create a market, there'll be all sorts of incentives. There'll be a lot of clever ways to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then that CO2 is no longer a pollutant in the atmosphere. It becomes a commodity into the thing we're trying to make that then we can sell for value yet again. So if you're a farmer, you sell your crop, you maybe could sell the energy you make from the crop waste with biogas, but you could also sell your CO2 sequestration services. Anytime we can create additional revenue streams for agriculture, I think that's good for Texas. We have enough agriculture, enough land, that this could be a non-trivial opportunity for really the nation or the world.
And let me add, this again highlights a really critical research and development opportunity that the state of Texas should be playing. Carbon offset markets are a huge growing financial opportunity. The reason that farmers are not yet able to really participate in those in a meaningful level is because there's no sensors that exist in the world right now that reliably monitor soil, that reliably monitor carbon concentrations in soil. Pecan is running a project that's funded by the National Science Foundation with the Texas Advanced Computing Center at UT right now, that's trying to bring together AI developers to see, can we identify trends in the data that do exist that let us reliably inform markets about soil carbon content changes over time, so farmers and ranchers could participate in these marketplaces. But this is an area that the entire world is looking at. sequestering carbon on farms and ranches. This is a huge data information technology challenge that's preventing all farmers and ranchers from being able to participate in this and then get the money that lets them fund that transition over to sustainable farming practices that have all these co-benefits of cleaner water, more sustainable soil on their property so their farms can produce more food and they can earn more revenue. Texas should be investing in starting up those technologies and companies that are going to change the world and ignite this big marketplace. There's all these opportunities that the people in Texas, like Michael Weber and Jim Blackburn at Rice, know need to be created to meet these global demands. But Texas doesn't offer any kind of significant resources to help leverage that knowledge to build out these companies and these economies.
So Texas as a state tends to lag. And so I'm wondering if there isn't an opportunity here. I mean, a kid, unfortunately, out of Westlake created a black market on the web for drugs and was convicted for it. Where's that kid to create a market for carbon capture? Where's the green coin equivalent to Bitcoin?
Well, and I think, let me add that I think you've got that creative maker capability here in Texas for sure. We've got amazing talent in this state, great public schools in some areas like Westlake, great universities, Texas A&M Prairie View. But when you get to the rubber hitting the road on letting these markets take off, that relies a lot on expensive technology development.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about a lot of investment in hardware and software.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of investment that other states, again, like New York and California, are making. And Texas is missing this big opportunity to leverage those great ideas and put them into action for these growing economies. Dr. Weber could have something like that and probably have, $1 billion in revenue that's generated from the companies that can meet those ideas in a year.
Well,
Yeah.
that's like a challenge.
I think there is an opportunity, but this is where policy would help to establish some rules of the market. Policy can really help create this opportunity.
I think it really could. So I've been taking vigorous notes because I'm learning so much from you all. I'm hoping that some of the bills that we've got in the Texas legislature this time around will pass and give us some momentum. But it sounds like there's a lot of work that we could be doing together outside the Texas legislature to, bad pun, to seed the clouds here, and get some things rolling that the Texas legislature would jump on the coattails of. Working with our urban communities on equity, working with our financial markets on emerging markets, working with our agricultural communities further afield out in those predominantly Republican areas that are really needing industry right now. And this could be their sustaining industry into future generations, if we can figure out how to describe it right.
And I want to add, and this is also something Michael and John and I have talked about, the policy is rational. The policy to lean into clean energy and lean into climate mitigation technologies, it's rational. The economics back up this story. What you're battling is ideological resistance, which is not rational. And so I struggle with, until there's a political sea change in Texas and more people vote, or we're not so gerrymandered in our districts, with the limitations of the Texas legislature in supporting these efforts. And that's just to the detriment of all Texans.
Well, Ms. Russo, you're echoing what Mr. Hall was saying earlier: vote, vote, vote. And the voter suppression and the gerrymandering is extremely concerning. So let's just bootstrap those two ideas into our Earth Day basket of things that we need to get on right away, is the redistricting and the voter suppression. We can roll that back by simply saying no. You can try and gerrymander us, and you can try and suppress us, but we're all coming for your seats. We're all
Senator.
your seats.
Amen.
Senator, I hate to cut in, but I wanted to just draw attention to the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
And when I say coming for your seats, I don't mean it in a threatening way. I mean it that we're coming to make sure that your seats are representing us. And seizing these opportunities that are so important for prosperity for every Texan. Because as you said, Dr. Weber, the cost of doing nothing is tremendous. And the people who will bear that cost are regular Texans. I really appreciate y'all in this conversation, and I really appreciate y'all learning me up on what our challenges are and what our opportunities are. And what's so great is this conversation has been so hopeful. We have all kinds of things to look forward to, and it is rational. The arc of justice, or the arc of the universe, is bending toward justice in this issue. I'm super happy about that.
But it doesn't bend by itself, so we all have a role to play, is what I would say.
We'll all put our shoulder into it. Thank you so much, y'all. Have a fabulous weekend when that weekend starts, and go ride a bike, fly a kite, enjoy Earth Day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Eckhart.
Thank you.